I used to scoff at old superstitions. Growing up in a small village surrounded by thick forests, I'd heard all the tales. People spoke in hushed tones about strange creatures lurking in the woods, creatures that had been there long before any of us. Of all the stories, the one that stuck out to me the most was the one about the Lisovyk, the forest spirit. A guardian, they said, of the deep woods, who could bend the trees to his will, control the animals, and punish those who disrespected his domain. I thought it was all nonsense, of course. At least, I did until last autumn, when I had my own encounter with something I still struggle to explain. It started innocently enough. I was a forestry surveyor, and my job often took me deep into the forest, miles from the village. That particular day, the weather had turned colder than expected, and the skies were heavy with clouds, promising rain. I had maps to finish and measurements to take, so I ignored the shifting winds and the growing darkness and pushed on deeper into the woods than I had ever gone before. I was alone, as I usually was, with only the sound of my boots crunching over the leaves and the occasional distant rustle of animals in the underbrush to keep me company. I liked the solitude. It gave me time to think, to clear my head. But that day, there was something different about the woods, something oppressive. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The birds stopped calling, and even the wind seemed to still. At first, I chalked it up to the approaching storm. But then, out of nowhere, the trees began to groan. Not in the way they normally do when the wind picks up, but as if something heavy was moving through them, bending them unnaturally. I stopped, listening, scanning the woods for movement, but there was nothing. Only that low, almost painful creaking, like the forest itself was straining against something unseen. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe some old, half-dead trees swaying. But then, I noticed something odd. My compass, the one I relied on in these dense woods, was spinning wildly. North, south, east, west. The needle wouldn't settle. I tapped it against my hand, thinking it was broken, but it just kept spinning. That's when I realized I had no idea which direction I'd come from. My map, my compass, everything was useless. I was lost. Panic started to rise in my chest, but I forced it down. I'd been trained for this, after all. I knew how to navigate even without tools. I just needed to retrace my steps. Except, the path I'd taken was no longer there. Where once there had been a clear trail, there were now only thick, gnarled roots and dense underbrush. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. I turned, looking for some sign, any sign, of where I'd come from, but the landscape was unfamiliar. Every tree looked the same, tall and dark and looming, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. The air had grown thick, almost suffocating, and I realized with a start that I hadn't heard any animal sounds in what felt like hours. No birds, no scurrying in the leaves, just silence. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. Tall, impossibly tall, and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too twisted to belong to anything human. It was standing completely still, watching me. It was hard to make out any details. Whatever it was partially obscured by the trees. But I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and cold, like the weight of the entire forest was pressing down on me. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. There was no answer, no movement, just that thing standing there watching. I don't know why I did it, but I took a step forward, toward it. As soon as I did, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows of the forest, like smoke being swallowed by the darkness. I was alone again, but the oppressive feeling lingered. I turned to leave, this time without caring about my measurements or the maps. I just wanted out. But every direction I turned, the woods seemed to close in tighter around me. The trees seemed to shift, their branches tangling together, blocking my way. And then I heard it, a voice, low and gravelly, like the sound of wind moving through dead leaves. It was speaking a language I didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Leave. But I couldn't. The forest wouldn't let me. I ran. I didn't care which direction. I just ran. Branches whipped at my face, and roots tried to trip me, but I kept going, heart hammering in my chest. I thought I could hear something following me, just behind, always just out of sight. It wasn't until I stumbled into a clearing, a part of the forest I recognized, that I finally stopped. Gasping for breath, I looked around. The trees were normal here. The oppressive weight was gone, but I could still feel it. The presence watching, waiting. I stood there, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. My chest ached, my lungs burning from the cold air and the sheer panic that had driven me to run. The clearing was calm, eerily calm, but the hairs on the back of my neck wouldn't settle. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but I was too exhausted, my legs trembling beneath me. For a moment, I dared to hope I was safe. Maybe I had outrun whatever that thing was. Maybe it had lost interest. But then I noticed something strange. The clearing, it didn't feel right. It looked like the one I knew, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No birds, no insects, not even the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw them. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Scattered around the edge of the clearing were small piles of stones, each one arranged carefully, deliberately. My eyes tracked over them, my pulse quickening again. There had to be at least a dozen, maybe more, circling the entire space. I knelt down, hesitating, before reaching out to touch one of the stones. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, a shiver ran through me. The stone was unnaturally cold, far colder than it should have been in the autumn air. It felt wrong, like I was disturbing something ancient, something that shouldn't be touched. I stood quickly, wiping my hands on my pants as if I could rid myself of the sensation. That's when I heard the whispering again. But this time it was closer, much closer. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was the same voice I'd heard before. The same guttural, rasping tone that had commanded me to leave. My body went rigid. Slowly, I turned to look back at the trees, but the shadows between them were too thick, too deep. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, watching me. The presence that had followed me from the depths of the forest was still here, lingering just beyond the edge of the clearing. Then the wind picked up again, softly at first, but it wasn't a natural breeze. The sound it made as it passed through the trees was wrong. It was almost like a melody, an eerie, dissonant tune carried on the wind, twisting and turning in the air around me. It filled my ears, drowning out my thoughts, making it hard to focus on anything but the rising tension in my chest. I started to back away, slowly at first, trying to keep my movements calm. But with every step I took, the wind grew stronger, the whispering louder. The trees around me began to groan again, their branches bending in unnatural ways, as if something was pushing them, guiding them. The shadows between the trunks seemed to shift, swirling and thickening like smoke. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure. It was barely visible, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the circle of stones. Taller than any man I'd ever seen, with limbs that were too long, too thin. Its skin, or what looked like skin, was a mottled grayish-green, like old bark, rough and knotted. His eyes, they were the worst part. Hollow, empty, yet I could feel them staring into me, through me. I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond. All I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as the figure slowly tilted its head to one side, like it was curious, studying me. The whispering stopped. Silence. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a breath, I heard it speak. Only 2 words this time, but they chilled me to the core. "You, stay." My heart hammered against my ribs, my throat dry and tight. The figure took a step, for war movements were slow, deliberate, and with each step, the ground beneath its feet seemed to darken, the grass withering and curling away from its presence. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to flee, to escape, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But I couldn't move. It stepped closer still, and I could see now that its body wasn't entirely solid. It shifted, its form flickering like a shadow caught between worlds, its features blurring and reforming with each step. I didn't know if it was real or a hallucination, but the terror was real enough. My chest tightened painfully, and I fought to keep my knees from buckling. The figure stopped just outside the circle of stones. It didn't cross the boundary. For a long moment, it stood there, watching me, its hollow eyes locked on mine. Then, slowly, it raised one long, gnarled finger and pointed at me. My skin prickled, every hair on my body standing on end. "You stay." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through me, shaking me to my core. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved back into the shadows, blending seamlessly into the trees, leaving me alone in the clearing once more. The silence returned, but it was different this time. The air felt thick with unseen eyes, the presence still lingering, even if I couldn't see it. The stones, the figure, the voice, the command. I wasn't sure if it was a warning or a threat, but one thing was clear. I wasn't welcome here, and yet, somehow, I knew leaving wouldn't be as simple as just walking away. The forest had changed, or maybe it had always been like this, and I had just never noticed. Whatever the case, I was no longer a visitor in these woods. I was a prisoner. The stones bothered me from the moment I saw them. They were out of place in the clearing, unnervingly deliberate. Small, rounded, carefully stacked, each one forming a perfect little mound. At first glance, you might think they were just markers, something innocent. But the way they circled the clearing, evenly spaced, it felt ritualistic. Like they were there for a reason that went beyond simple human logic. As I stood there, staring at them, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were more than just random piles of rocks. I'd seen enough in my line of work, trails marked by foresters, boundary stones left by farmers, but these were different. I wasn't an expert on folklore, but growing up in the village, I'd heard enough stories about old tradition. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the atmosphere in the clearing, the unnatural silence, the strange stillness, made me wonder if these stones weren't serving some forgotten purpose. Maybe they were a warning, a boundary line. Whatever the case, one thing was clear. Someone had put them here, and whoever they were, they knew these woods better than I did. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe local hunters had stacked the stones as markers, or maybe it was part of some old forest management project. But the more I stared at them, the less any of those explanations made sense. There was something unsettling about how the stones seemed untouched by the elements. They weren't moss-covered or weathered like you'd expect after sitting in the forest for years. They looked freshly placed, like they'd been arranged recently. I felt a creeping discomfort crawl up my spine. I kept coming back to the same thought. The stones were there for a reason, and that reason was tied to the forest, to whatever was in the trees watching. I didn't touch them again after that. I wasn't sure if it was superstition or instinct, but something told me those stones weren't to be disturbed. They were a line, an unspoken rule. I kept my distance from the stones after that. The rational part of my mind tried to push the unease aside. But deep down, something had shifted. I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling that those stones weren't just markers. They were a boundary I wasn't meant to cross, but I had already crossed it. I stood in the clearing, forcing myself to calm down, to think clearly. I needed to get out of the forest, to find my way back to familiar ground, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. Even though the figure had vanished into the trees, I still felt its presence, lurking at the edge of my vision, just beyond the clearing. Watching, I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, trying to gather the courage to move. But eventually, my instincts took over. I needed to leave. Now, the path I'd come in on was gone, swallowed up by the forest. But there had to be another way out. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of a trail or an opening. The forest was dense, the trees crowding together like they were deliberately trying to block my escape. But there, just to the left, near a break in the underbrush, I thought I saw something. A faint path, barely visible, winding deeper into the woods. It wasn't the direction I'd come from, but it was the only option I had. I took a deep breath and started walking, careful to avoid the stones. As I stepped past the last of them, I felt a subtle shift in the air, like crossing an invisible line. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep moving. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how strange the forest felt. The trees seemed taller here, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out most of the light. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and damp leaves that made every step feel uncertain, like the earth beneath me was ready to give way at any moment. There were no sounds, no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the rhythmic crunch of my boots and the faint echo of my breath in the silence. But the further I walked, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew. Every few minutes, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure standing there again, watching me from the shadows. But there was never anything there, just the oppressive silence of the forest. I don't know how long I walked before I saw it. An old wooden structure, barely visible through the trees. A cabin, small and weathered, hidden deep in the forest where no one should have been. It didn't make any sense. There were no paths leading to it, no signs that anyone had been there in years. The wood was dark and rotting in places, the windows covered in grime. The roof sagged under the weight of time and neglect, and vines crawled up the walls, as if nature had been trying to reclaim it. My first instinct was to turn around, to leave it behind and keep walking. But something about drew me in. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the growing fear of whatever was out there in the woods. Or maybe it was just the hope that I could find something, anything that would help me understand what was happening. I approached cautiously, stepping over the tangled roots that surrounded the clearing. The air felt thick, as if the forest itself was trying to push me back, but I ignored it. I reached the front door and hesitated. It was slightly ajar, the wood swollen from years of rain and decay, but the darkness beyond it seemed to beckon. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. It was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and something else I couldn't quite place. The floor was covered in dust, but there were no signs of recent activity. It was as if the place had been abandoned for years, untouched by anyone. Yet, despite the emptiness, I felt the distinct sense that someone, or something, had been here recently. There was a small, rickety table in the center of the room, and on it, something that immediately caught my attention. A crude map, hand-drawn on yellowed paper, lay spread across the surface. It was rough and unfinished, but I recognized the general layout of the forest. Trails were marked, some leading deeper into the woods, while others looped back toward the village. But what unnerved me the most were the small circles drawn on the map, dozens of them scattered throughout the forest. Each one corresponded to a location I couldn't identify, except for one. One that matched exactly where I was standing, the clearing with the stones. I realized what the circles might represent. I didn't want to think about what that meant, what those places were, who or what had marked them, but the feeling of being watched, the oppressive silence, the figure I'd seen in the woods, it all started to come together, forming a picture I didn't want to understand. I folded the map, shoving it into my jacket. I needed to get out, and I needed to do it fast. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A movement outside the window. I froze. The same figure was standing there, its shadowy form just visible through the dirty glass. Tall, too tall, its twisted limbs blending with the dark shapes of the trees. It hadn't moved. It was just there, watching me. I took a step back, my pulse racing. The room felt smaller, the air closing in around me. I knew I couldn't stay, but stepping outside meant facing whatever was waiting for me. The figure remained still, its hollow eyes locked on mine, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. For a long moment we stood like that, me inside the rotting cabin, and it standing just beyond the trees. And then, without warning, it took a step forward. This time, there was no mistaking its intent. I had to get out. Now, the figure outside. It was closer now, its long, twisted limbs shifting unnaturally. There was no way I could outrun it. I could barely think, my mind racing, trying to find some escape, some way out that didn't involve stepping into its path. I glanced at the back door, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the grime-covered windows. My only option was to slip out the other side of and hope it didn't follow. My legs felt shaky, my breath shallow, but I forced myself to move. I didn't dare look out the window again. I didn't want to see how close it had gotten. Reaching the door, I grasped the rusty handle and pulled gently. It barely budged. My heart sank as I realized it was stuck. Each sound felt like a beacon, calling to the thing outside. Finally, with a loud crack, the door came free, swinging open into the dark woods behind. I stood there for a split second, paralyzed by the thought of stepping out into that suffocating darkness, but I had no choice. I had to go. Now, I sprinted out the door, ducking low, and darted into the thick underbrush. The forest immediately swallowed me up, the branches clawing at my jacket, my face, as I pushed through. My pulse thundered in my ears, every instinct screaming at me to run faster, but I could barely see where I was going. Behind me, I heard it, a heavy, deliberate movement. The figure wasn't far. It was following me, its presence impossibly close. I could hear the soft rustle of leaves, the faint cracking of branches. But there was something else, too. A low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the trees, as though the forest itself was reacting to its presence. I didn't stop, couldn't. My lungs burned, and every step felt heavier than the last. But the fear pushing me forward was stronger than the exhaustion creeping into my legs. I veered left, then right, hoping to lose it in the maze of trees. The forest felt alive around me, shifting, the landscape constantly changing, making it impossible to tell where I was. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides. I couldn't tell how far I'd gone or how long I'd been running, but my energy was draining fast. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw it. The faintest glimmer of light through the trees ahead. A break in the darkness. A way out. I stumbled toward it, pushing through the last of the tangled branches, and suddenly I was free. The oppressive weight of the forest lifted, and I found myself standing on the edge of an old road, barely more than a dirt path. But it was something. It was familiar. I recognized this place. It was the same road that led back to the village. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I kept moving, even as my legs screamed in protest. even as every muscle ached. I needed to put as much distance between me and the forest as I could. It wasn't until I reached the first faint signs of the village that I finally stopped. I leaned against a tree, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The forest was behind me now, silent and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, what had happened in those woods. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and, truthfully, I didn't want to relive it. But the experience changed something in me. I still work in the forest. I still walk those trails, map the land, and go deeper into the woods than most people dare to go. But I avoid certain areas now. I don't stray off the paths, and I don't ignore the signs, the little things most people overlook. A broken branch, a circle of stones, the unnatural silence that descends at the edge of the deep woods. I never saw the figure again, but sometimes, when I'm out there alone, I feel it. The weight of those hollow eyes, watching from the shadows, waiting just beyond the trees. And I know that if I ever cross that line again, if I ever step back into the wrong part of the forest, I won't make it out next time. The Lisovyk doesn't forget.